Good morning. Welcome to the Global Meet webinar hosted by the Virginia Hospital and Healthcare Association and EnableComp to discuss the 2018 Workers' Compensation Hospital Fee Schedule. My name is Alex. I just have a couple of items to review before we begin. This webinar is being recorded and your line is muted. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation and we will answer as many as we can at the end. Let's get started. I'd like to introduce Jay Andrews, Vice President of Financial Policy for the VHHA.
Thank you, Allie, and good morning, everyone. Again, this is Jay Andrews, and I'm the Vice President of Financial Policy for the Virginia Hospital and Healthcare Association, and have been on the advisory panel for over 2+ years working with them, which includes providers, payers, businesses, and actual workers' comp commission, and we've worked together to develop both the language and then also the final fee schedule that's been developed. The fee schedule is created in conjunction with the advisory panel and with the actuarial firm Oliver Wyman, who worked on this. Thank you for joining the webinar today to hear our guest speakers from EnableComp. The Virginia Hospital and Healthcare Association has been engaged with EnableComp for quite some time as we prepare for this first ever work comp fee schedule in Virginia. I'm excited to introduce our great speakers that we have today, David White, Senior Vice President of Reimbursement, and Jesse Larson, Vice President of Managed Care. Between the two of them, they have over 45 years of workers' comp experience and knowledge. I am pleased to have them with us today to explain the details of the upcoming fee schedule, the key points to consider, guidance as we approach the go-live date this January for the fee schedule. I'll turn it over to you guys and Allie. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. Before we jump into the presentation, I want to briefly share some information about who we are for those on the call who might not be familiar with EnableComp. EnableComp is a full-service revenue cycle management company that exclusively handles work comp. We service over 600 hospitals nationwide, including 36 in Virginia. Our focus is to provide more revenue per claim, eliminate payment delays, and reduce your overall AR. If you'd like to learn more about EnableComp and our services, please reach out to us after the webinar, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. With that, I'm going to turn the call over to David White and Jesse Larson to get us started.
Thanks, Allie. Well, welcome, everybody. I'm glad to have so many people on the call here today. I think this is a record number for us. We had a call earlier this year, so we're excited to have so many interested hospital folks from across the country and in Virginia to learn about what's happening in Virginia and what's going to happen in just a few months from a fee schedule standpoint. As Jay and Allie mentioned, my name is Jesse Larson. I oversee policy advisement here at EnableComp, and one of our chief goals is to monitor and report on legislative and industrial changes that have material impact to our hospital clients, both in Virginia and across the country. So as you can imagine, we and the rest of the work comp community across the country have been watching Virginia for quite some time as the changes within the comp industry have been significant over the past few years. And now, with the creation of the first ever work comp fee schedule, it's a whole new ballgame. But before we dive into the guts of the fee schedule and share our principal findings and the recommendations for next steps, let's talk a little bit about how we got to this point. So most states that have no fee schedule have some type of usual and customary verbiage. And, Virginia was no different. Virginia defined usual and customary reimbursement as what they call the prevailing community rate, or PCR. A prevailing community rate is problematic. It has been problematic in Virginia because it's never been defined further in the Virginia Code. Medical bills that are issued in Virginia, case law has shown that they've been, considered prima facie, which is it's correct until it's proven otherwise. It really puts the onus on the carrier and the provider, on the payers, to determine that the charges are not reasonable. But really, that's kind of where the definitions within the code end. And the volume of data and industry perspective within Virginia is that provider rates are among the highest in the country, and think tanks and industry groups like WCRI and NCCI have published numerous reports and studies, kind of alluding to the fact that Virginia has a high reimbursable amount for work comp. And so all of these things have created a gulf between what provider charges and what payer expectations are. And these generated a large amount of disputes, as you can imagine. And I'm sure many on the call have had to deal with payers that dispute the charges for services rendered for work comp in Virginia. The Work Comp Commission is dealing with anywhere from approximately 2,000 medical disputes at any given time. It's an unbelievable amount of problems to deal with in defining what the reimbursable amount should be and what's reasonable. Payers and carriers and third-party administrators and delivery companies have invested millions of dollars into cost containment solutions to find opportunities to pay less on these in these types of scenarios, and providers struggle with the ability to deal with certain underpayments and budget appropriately for what they should expect for the work comp pay class. So this kind of all came to a head several years ago in March of 2015 when Governor McAuliffe signed into law Chapter 456, which really kind of gave the Work Comp Commission the charge to go and get the data needed to establish a fee schedule. The Work Comp Commission convened a group, a task force, to take a look at what that would look like, what they would need to collect, what would be the blocking and tackling required to create a fee schedule. And in October of 2015, the geographic communities were broken into 6 different groups. And you can see those 6 groups range anywhere from Richmond in Region 3 to Virginia Beach and Norfolk over in Region 4. You got Roanoke in Region 5, Harrisonburg up there in Region 2. These 6 defined medical communities were really what the commission determined, the task force determined would be how charges and reimbursements should be broken out geographically. Moving on to where we went into 2016, Senate Bill 631 really gave the authority that was needed to create the fee schedule. That fee schedule was determined to go live January of 2018. I think most people on the call understand that that's happening very soon, and changes that need to be made within hospital CBOs from a budgetary standpoint and payment and reimbursement. We're running short on time to be able to go live in January, so hospitals need to really understand that is happening very quickly, and this has been in the works for quite some time. The actuarial firm Oliver Wyman was hired by the commission to take on what was a very substantial task of identifying what is the charge and payment history throughout Virginia over a period of a couple of years to identify what would be expected. And by doing that and using NCCI data calls, they collected millions of pieces of data and assembled 7 different fee schedules to cover all provider types in Virginia, from hospitals, teaching and otherwise, to ambulatory surgery centers, surgeons, non-surgeons, and other miscellaneous providers. One of the key components of this development and this analysis was to put together a fee schedule that would be revenue neutral. And revenue neutrality is something that is discussed within the ground rules, but it's not easily understood because revenue neutral is going to be revenue neutral over a community, and a community of providers or one of the 7 different provider types. We're going to talk about the implications of revenue neutrality throughout the call, so if you have any questions, we'll be able to answer that later on as well, too. Please do direct your cursor up to the Q&A bar at the top of the webinar if you have questions throughout the presentation. Put those in. We'll address them later on. So the analysis was done by Oliver Wyman, and the first draft of the fee schedule was released earlier this year. Most industry stakeholders like EnableComp and other industry providers for work comp revenue cycle took a look at the information, modeled the tables that were published, looked at the ground rules, and provided feedback back to the Work Comp Commission. And that happened on several iterations throughout the beginning of the year. We are right now in the final stages of the fee schedule publication. The ground rules have essentially been frozen since about June. There have been a couple of changes that happened recently in October, but feedback loop is still open, and there will be a link that we'll share later in the call for providers to take a look at. And if there's issues that are specific to your facility or system that come up on this call, or questions that you have, or changes that you would suggest, there is still an opportunity to provide a feedback loop back to the Work Comp Commission. There were several objectives that the Work Comp Fee Schedule Task Force had to develop in Oliver Wyman. David, can you kind of walk us through some of these objectives and what Oliver Wyman did to try and make those happen?
Thank you, Jesse. Yeah, I think what we wanted to do was just kind of give an overview of the framework in which Oliver Wyman constructed this fee schedule based upon the direction. And the first thing, of course, was to define specific rates by service type or category, meaning moving from a system where right now things are based upon charges overall on a bill, and really move towards a fee schedule that has specific rates for specific procedures. The next thing that objectively that they wanted to do was, Jesse mentioned, there are over 2,000 disputes right now. It's really kind of becoming unwieldy. They wanted to decrease those number of medical fee disputes by having specific rates and tables that both providers and payers could use as guideposts. The reimbursement objective in creating these fee schedules was to create the fee schedules by category and by community. So the data that Oliver Wyman looked at and everything that was gathered was based on the individual region for the individual type of provider. So all of this data was looked at essentially in a vacuum from each one. So rates were developed all independently of each other. And as you can see, we've put a little box in there to describe what the regulations say about revenue neutrality and what the objective is there. And revenue neutrality was really the objective was to make this fee schedule revenue neutral for every provider within a given region. So it's based upon what those providers got paid in that given region for that type of service over the periods 2014 and 2015, and we'll talk a little bit later on as to what type of disparity that creates in the overall marketplace. With having essentially 42 different fee schedules, and on the hospital side, 6 different fee schedules, certainly for inpatient services.
Thanks, David. Yeah, that's very true, right? So we have a lot of different fee schedules. It's very complex in the number of tables that have been published for all the different provider groups. Each one has a different set, and each set is broken up by 6 regions. So you can imagine there's a level of complexity here that providers and payers are going to struggle with in 2018. But let's take a look at the specific framework of how the fee schedule works, both for inpatient, outpatient, hospital, how hospitals should expect to get paid, and how they should model reimbursement. From an inpatient standpoint, you've got an effective date that is hard at January 1, 2018. So regardless of the injury date, it's going to be based on services that are rendered on or after January 1, 2018 will all be expected to be reimbursed at the 2018 fee schedule amount. When you talk about the acute care inpatient admissions, which I believe most on the call are really focused on, it's really broken out by 2 different types. You've got teaching hospitals, type 1 teaching hospitals, which can be relegated to Table A, and then the all other hospitals, which would be under Table B. And those reimbursable amounts are going to be DRG focused. So it's going to be a global reimbursement for the inpatient stay based on that DRG. There's no additional reimbursement for implants or supplies. All of the things that we deal with right now in an inpatient scenario with itemization and payments for different services on inpatient is all rolled up into a single DRG payment for most acute care admissions. That table is published out there on the WorkComp site for everyone to take a look at, and we'll talk a little bit later about making sure that your finance folks or your CBO folks are taking a look at what those numbers are and comparing them to your historical data to really budget and expect how's that going to impact your inpatient reimbursement next year. So flat rates on the DRG table. Now, there is an outlier scenario, a stop-loss provision in the fee schedule for additional reimbursement for charges of an exceptional nature, and we're going to talk a little bit about that here in just a second. And then really the third carve-out for inpatient framework is the trauma centers. Level 1, Level 2 trauma burn centers are not paid at the DRG rate table. They are specifically paid at a flat 80% of charge ratio. So if you are operating an L1, L2 trauma or a burn center, that's what you should be expecting from payers per the fee schedule, but we know that the payers are very adept in cutting down bills even at fee schedule rates for things that are related services or excessive services or services for which there's no documentation. We're not going to get into too much of the details of kind of the thrust and parry between providers and payers in the work comp scenario, but just know that for burns and traumas, 80% of charges is in the fee schedule, but we expect it will be challenged. Moving into the outlier provision. The outlier provision is we talked about this earlier. It's an additional reimbursement method for extraordinary services rendered. And for those that are not on the webinar and just dialing in, I'll kind of walk you through the calculation very quickly. It's a pretty simple outlier scenario, and I'll tell you this, most states that have fee schedules that do have some type of stop-loss or outlier provision. So the outlier that Virginia has adopted is very similar to what we see in other states, and it kind of goes this way. If you have a charge for a procedure that is rendered that is more than 3 times what the fee schedule will allow, then you are going to get 80% of whatever that overage is. Okay, so it's not too complex, but I'll tell you, and history has told us that payers struggle to pay correctly in these outlier provisions, and these are also, this is low-hanging fruit for the payer community to operate in a bill review environment and cut down charges that may hit that stop-loss provision, because certainly the 80% of the excess can get expensive on very large bills. The calculation that works out is this: if you had an $82,000 charge and the fee schedule said you would get paid $25,000 for that particular DRG, and the outlier threshold is set at $75,000, that would be 3 times the fee schedule amount. Okay? Well, because 3 times the fee schedule amount is $75,000 and your charges are higher than that, there's an overage of $7,000, and that $7,000 is paid at the outlier percentage, and that's 80%. So the provider is entitled to an additional $5,600 on top of the original fee schedule amount of $25,000. So the net reimbursable amount for this outlier scenario is $30,600. It's a simple calculation, but you can understand that in large scenarios, very expensive bills, the outlier threshold can be very good to try and reimburse hospitals for those extraordinarily costly procedures. All right, let's talk a little bit about the outpatient framework. Outpatient is paid very differently. It's going to be codified on tables for CPT or HCPCS codes. So if you go to the work comp website, the Virginia Work Comp Commission website, download the tables, you'll see tables F through I cover both code types for teaching and non-teaching hospitals. And so services rendered in an outpatient scenario will get paid per that CPT or HCPCS code. Now, there are scenarios in an outpatient for services that are carved out of that and not paid at a codified rate, but paid at the bill charge. And those services are specifically pharmacy surgeries, pharmacy services, med-surg supplies, implants, and we're going to talk about surgical implants later on because they are a big deal in Virginia. And anesthesia, recovery room, and other types of procedures listed are not paid at a CPT table, but they're rather paid at percentage of charges. Now, if you take a look at Table E in the fee schedule, it will tell you what your percent of charge reimbursable rate is for these carved out outpatient services by region. And those percent of charge rates range from 75% on up to 83%. So you're going to want to identify, hey, where are my facilities? What regions are they in? So I can identify these particular carve-out procedures by rev code and make sure that I'm modeling the correct percentage of charge expected for those. So it's a little bit more complex than inpatient. And again, as we see these layers of complexity, we understand that payers are going to struggle with paying providers appropriately, and it's going to be the onus is going to be on the providers or their partners, like EnableComp, to ensure that proper reimbursement is occurring in January. One of the things that has come out of this fee schedule is a level of transparency that we have not seen before in Virginia between provider charges and payments. And because of all the work that Oliver Wyman did through the actuarial analysis of doing the data call over 2 years and putting this out there, you really see wide differences in what has been historically reimbursed and what is now fee schedule reimbursement for services across the states. David, let's talk a little bit about the heat map and some of the disparities between one region to another for similar services.
Thanks, Jesse. We had mentioned before the framework under which Oliver Wyman developed these rates, and had mentioned that all of this data, each of those individual regional fee schedules were developed based on that region's data only. And what this heat map really shows us is here are the 10 most common work comp DRGs and what the rates are in each individual region, and you can see the wide disparity between from one region to another, and that is created, of course, by the way in which these fee schedules were developed to create revenue neutrality within each region. So you can see, for example, a Region 3 hospital for DRG 460, a spinal fusion, is going to get paid $150,000, while a Region 6 hospital would get paid $35,000 for the same DRG, the same service. And we do see other regional variations, for example, in Medicare, but the Medicare regional differences obviously are much different than that. There may only be a 5% difference, from one region or one geographic area in a state to another. So this type of disparity is something we'll talk about a little bit later. What's going to be happening here in the marketplace? How will the market react because these prices are so different from one region to another? And I think as we move to the outpatient side, you can see that there is still a wide variation between regions as well, not as pronounced as it is on the inpatient side, but these are the most frequent work comp procedures on the outpatient side, and you can see there is still a large degree of variability from one region to another. Okay, I think, as I said, we'll talk about a little bit later on the payer behavior implications of what we think that might be for this particular scenario and other pieces of the fee schedule as well. Jesse, I wonder if you want to go ahead and talk about the additional provisions in the fee schedule.
Yeah, we talked about the framework of the inpatient-outpatient reimbursement, but there are additional provisions that we want to address. Those are going to be listed in the ground rules. I would encourage everyone to download, take a look at those. They're very clearly mapped out. They've gone through a couple of iterations even recently here in October. But some specific components that the fee schedule does not apply to, and then in Virginia this is especially evident, PPO contracts. Virginia is a highly contracted state. Most of the providers that we deal with have multiple PPO contracts for work comp. Fee schedule reimbursement will not apply to those contracts. Those contracts will kind of remain the source of truth for what reimbursement is for services rendered through those contracts. Secondly, there's a provision for voluntary payments. These would be payments by a carrier or a self-insured employer in excess of the fee schedule. It's perfectly acceptable, and it falls outside of the fee schedule jurisdiction, so fee schedule would not apply to those payments. And the third thing that is really carved out of the jurisdictional oversight for the fee schedule is air ambulance. For those of you that kind of follow the work comp industry news, you'll understand that air ambulance is a very hot topic among states and provider disputes because of the problems that arise in crossing state lines with air ambulance and how whether states or the federal government retains ownership over what that reimbursable amount should be. So Virginia has wisely chosen to bar air ambulance from the work comp fee schedule to not get involved in those disputes. The provisions that we've alluded to, and we'll get into some details additionally, are obviously lesser of. Lesser of provision, it seems small, but it is very, very important. And it is a component that exists in other fee schedules in other states. And what it means is the lesser of your charge or the fee schedule amount is what the fee schedule is. It's not what's published in the tables. So your charges on a line item level, not on a global level, but on a line item level, really are going to be dictating what your reimbursable amount is. So you have to understand that as you communicate with your financial folks to understand and budget what to expect. How is my work comp going to be impacted next year? You've got to make sure you understand how the lesser of provision works. If you're confused about that or if you have additional questions, please follow up with me and my team after the call. We'll be happy to answer any questions and try and bring some clarity to how lesser of is going to impact your business and how the payers. I'll tell you this, the payer community is very adept at applying lesser of rules in these type of scenarios. The NCCI initiatives, they do exist. These are common coding initiatives. Most on the call may be aware of them. We see them in group commercial, but for sure there are some questions in UNC states whether NCCI coding and bundling edits are allowable in UNC states. Well, there's no question now in Virginia. They have been adopted for quite some time into the rules, and they are a part of this fee schedule. The fee schedule talks about multiple procedure rules. I'm not going to get into the mechanics of that, but there are allowables for discounts to be provided to payers who are seeing bills where multiple procedures are rendered in the same scenario. I would recommend everyone read those rules and understand how to identify how that impacts reimbursement. And then an additional provision that was recently added, Jay, I guess it was added just about a month ago, is the periodic review of the fee schedules. And we've had a lot of questions from our providers and questions from industry stakeholders about some of the things that we've all looked at and seen in the analysis of this fee schedule. And then that logical question is, well, what's going to happen after January 1 when everyone reacts to this and the rubber meets the road? Are there going to be some big problems? Is it going to blow up somewhere? Is it going to be a big problem between payers and providers? There's been a lot of work put into trying to alleviate that, but the opportunity to take a look at the fee schedule and make reviews has now been put back in, and the Commission has committed to review the ground rules biannually and make the necessary adjustments as directed by the Virginia Code. You know, payer behavior is something that we've alluded to. It's something that we at EnableComp are very akin to. David and myself are former payer guys, come over to the providers, and so we understand how payers work and operate, how bill review companies exist, but we understand the needs of our client hospitals and how to get paid appropriately. So understanding the payer behavior is just as important in work comp as modeling fee schedules and budgeting, so you can have an effective expectation of what 2018 is going to look like. David, can you talk a little bit about what our providers on the call should expect from a behavioral standpoint?
Thanks, Jesse. Yeah. We had mentioned earlier when we were looking at the heat maps, the wide pricing between the regions. And what we certainly expect to see is carriers price shopping here because there's such a wide variation. You know, if you can pay $30,000 in one region for the same service as you would have to pay $150,000 in another, you would expect as a payer you're going to look at ways to be able to redirect that care. And we've gotten some indication from a few payers that they're already looking at ways to do that. How will that happen? What are the implications? Will it filter through PPO contracts or direct contracts? We're not really sure right now, but what we are saying is the market will likely react to this disparity in price, and there will be price shopping out there. So please be aware of that, and that payers will be attempting to direct care to the most cost-effective setting for them. Also wanted to talk a little bit about the outpatient implant reimbursement. As Jesse mentioned, implants are the cost and payment for implants are included on the inpatient side in the DRG bundle. But on the outpatient side, they are payable at anywhere from 75 to 83% of billed charges, depending upon the region. And there is specific language in the fee schedule that says that cost documentation will not be required for payment of any implants on the outpatient side. You all may be familiar with vendors out there like Foresight, who specifically address the implant issue and try to reimburse based on some type of cost basis. That, of course, all goes away under this new fee schedule. Not that we don't expect to see some attempts by payers and people in the marketplace to do that, but it is.
You mean count on it, right?
Yeah.
It will happen.
Yes, it likely will be challenged. So we do expect to see that, and but it's important to know that the fee schedule is very clear in that implants are to be paid as a percentage of charges and not cost-based. It's also important to remember that in order to get paid for your implants on the outpatient side, you have to have a HCPC code assigned to that individual Rev Code 278 line item. And our experience in looking at most providers' billings is that those HCPC codes are present most of the time, but not all the time. So you probably want to check your billing practices and make sure that HCPCs are being generated for all your outpatient implant invoices or your outpatient service invoices that have implants on them.
And remember, they do have the fee schedule specifically itemizes the LA699 code for implants that do not have one assigned. So even if there is not a code assignable in your chargemaster group, your coders should make sure to include that LA699 for those types of implants to ensure payment, right, David?
Yes, thank you, Jesse. And your coder should check the language on that to make sure that they follow what the regulations say there. Right. As Jesse mentioned before, NCCI rules are now coding rules are now applicable. So absolutely expect that these will be applied by payers. Most of the bill review systems have NCCI bundling edits built into them, so they will now be turned on under this fee schedule, certainly. So it's important to have a good understanding of those and be aware of them as you review EOBs. And finally, Jesse was going through the example of the outlier provision for inpatient services, and we saw that that's bill charge based. Certainly a practice we see regularly in other states that have similar provisions is payers take a particular focus on making sure that that charges that are audited for to try to make sure that I don't want to say to try to get every bill under the
it's definitely a target, though, right?
Yeah, the stop loss threshold, but certainly they will be looking at at removing services from those larger cost bills,
especially claims that have stop loss that come close to the threshold or closer to the threshold. We've seen practices before where reductions by the payers just bring the reimbursable amount below the stop loss threshold.
That's right.
And that is not a unique scenario. It does exist out there, so the billing offices need to be aware. Claims that are near the threshold may see that type of practice occur, and payers are very adept at using clinical resources and other types of tools to try and deny charges for relevance and documentation and things like that.
Thanks, Jesse. You want to talk about a little bit about managed care contracting going forward under the new fee schedule?
Yeah, I'd be remiss if we didn't get into some of the PPO contract issues that exist. We talked about this earlier. Virginia, along with Arizona and New Jersey, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and other states that are usual and customary, are full of PPO contracts for work comp. In an environment without regulation, PPO contract is the regulation. So I'm sure many of the folks on the call, if you were to talk with your payer contract folks, to your managed care folks, you would know you've got quite a few PPO contracts. The first thing that you've got to make sure that you're doing is, from a managed care standpoint, or if you have a consultant like EnableComp working with you to evaluate your PPO contracts on the work comp side, is really identify what does the reimbursable language look like in those contracts, and are they charge-based versus fee schedule-based? Are there particular caveats within your contracts that may have maybe have been historically not relevant to a UNC state like Virginia, but now instantly have implications in a fee schedule environment? A lot of contracts that we see in Virginia are legacy contracts that extend back 10, 15 years, 20 years. Boy, now is a good time to do that because, as we said earlier, it's all the ballgame in January, and your contracts are going to be playing by those new rules. We have seen contracts that have multiple rate provisions. One is a charge-based and the other is a fee schedule. I know we paid any attention to the fee schedule rates of the contracts because there wasn't one in Virginia. Well, those now become effective in January by virtue of the fee schedule. So if you have contracts that have rates that are fee schedule focused and you're not aware of them, be prepared for payers to start paying via those discounted rates in Virginia and not the historical charge-based ones. The good thing about the fee schedule is because of the revenue neutrality provision, charge-based discounts should translate into a fee schedule discount pretty seamlessly. All things being equal, a 10% discount last year in a charge environment should be a 10% discount in a fee schedule environment next year, provided the revenue neutrality holds true for you. Again, the onus is on everyone on this call to make sure you understand how that revenue neutrality affects you, because obviously the charge discounts moving to fee schedule discount will impact that revenue neutrality as well. Second thing I would like to draw attention to is for the systems on the call that have multiple locations spread throughout different regions, really, really understand how those different rates by region could impact your PPO contracting. It may make sense to try and offer different discounts by region based on those services, to try and retain services in one region or grow services in another. So a more sophisticated contracting strategy would make sense for systems that have facilities that cross regional lines, knowing that the reimbursable rates will be very different. Thirdly, I would say give yourself time to review and amend these contracts. I know for our providers on the call, we've already done that in many cases and have a strategy going forward, which we're implementing for chance to look at that yet, go ahead and do it now. It can take time for networks and payers to disseminate change information out to the field. So if you want to have things started by January 1, go ahead and begin those now. And then lastly is make sure you have a strategy. Make sure that for your CFOs on the call, the rev cycle folks, make sure you're communicating with your managed care people. You guys are on the same page with respect to what revenue you can expect in 2018 and what payer contracting is going to do about it. The strategy may be, hey, let's wait and see what the payers do and what the networks do, and that's fine. Just make sure that you understand that's what you're doing. You have a plan. It may be let's have networks come to us, or it may be let's get proactive and go out and get in front of networks and recontract. So make sure you understand what your strategy is, develop your goals now for how you're going to hit 2018. We're getting into 2018 and the timeline. This timeline there have been a lot of milestones on the timeline for the development of this thing. And for those that were on the call last spring, this was a very different slide. But now we're coming toward the end of the year, the end of the race, getting ready to start in January. Just a few weeks ago, the task force met and posted the kind of final revisions to the website. Again, I would direct everyone to the Virginia Work Comp Commission website to see what those are. And as Jay and we spoke about earlier, the forum is still open to submit suggestions, questions, and feedback back to the commission. I'll tell you, the feedback loop that the Work Comp Commission has opened has been really astounding. Most states that go through this process and create fee schedules or make changes, I wouldn't say they do them in a vacuum, but I've not seen the type of kind of transparency and feedback that the commission has asked for. So I would challenge everyone on this call to use that to their advantage. Make sure you know how these provisions are going to impact your billing for next year. How are you going to budget for work comp revenue in 2018? And if you see anomalies that impact you, certainly get with us and ask us questions. If you have them, we'll give clarity where we can. But definitely make sure you communicate your concerns to the Virginia Work Comp Commission. Jay, I believe there will be one more meeting at the end of the month to try to review these and make kind of final changes. Is that correct?
It will not be on the fee schedule. This is just for the things that were not addressed, such as pharmacy and DME. So it doesn't have anything to do with the existing fee schedule.
If anybody does have questions about how the fee schedule is going to impact them, I would make sure that you follow up with us. So we're going to have contact information at the end of the call. We'll be happy to answer those and get those turned around to you pretty quickly. Just to summarize, we've talked about the impact on inpatient, outpatient, and the history of the fee schedule. I hope everyone on the call understands what a big change this is. We've never seen this before. David, I've never seen this before in medical billing, a change of this magnitude to this type.
This is a very, very different style fee schedule, and particularly the geographic diversity is much different than what we've seen in other markets.
Yeah. So understand from where we sit, this is a big deal, and we hope that you all can kind of take that back internally and understand what the impact is going to be on your work comp pay class. Really understand what the published rates are going to do in your area from a payer behavior standpoint. Take a look at the managed care contracting and make sure to give feedback. So I know we've spent a little bit more than our allotted time on going over the guts of the fee schedule and our principal findings, but we've received quite a lot of questions that we'd like to give some time to address. And remember, if you have questions, go ahead and click on that Q&A link at the top, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And for the ones we can't get on the call, we'll follow up individually afterwards. So, Allie, you want to take us on our first question?
Yeah, so the first question, the slides will be made available here in the next few days on our website, so be sure to check back for those. The PowerPoint presentation will be live. The first question that we had is the January 1 effective date for inpatients the admission date of 1/1 or the discharge date of 1/1?
It's the discharge date. That's a good question. Almost in all cases, we see that it's the discharge date. Very few states will actually claim the admit date as the effective date. So date of discharge for the services rendered.
Please touch base on the multiple procedure rule. I can't seem to find the rule. I assume 100% for first and 50% for each additional, with the highest reimbursement procedure receiving the 100%.
Yes, that's correct. There are specifics in multiple procedure rules, and I tell you what, if we want to skip to another question, I'll pull up where that page is and reference it here in just a little bit.
Okay. Had the VHHA completed any facility implication estimates?
Jay,
No, we have not been able. Yeah, I will speak on that. No, we have not done any kind of estimates because we don't have any workers' comp information. All the information was sent directly to Oliver Wyman, and we do not have access to any of the facility data, and it's not available on the inpatient database because it's not broken down enough to really be able to do an analysis. So we apologize there.
Again, the commission spent a lot of money on Oliver Wyman to create things that were revenue neutral, and their expectation and all of their actuarial work is an expectation that for each individual hospital within a region that this is going to be neutral. Whether things pan out that way, whether redirection of care impacts that service mix and whatever, I think that remains to be seen, but certainly the expectation is that it's revenue neutral.
David, I want to clarify, it's not going to be revenue neutral by hospital. It'll be revenue neutral by provider type, by region.
Yes, thank you, Jay.
Absolutely. Getting back to the earlier comment about multiple procedure rules, MPR is going to be on page 14 and 15 of the ground rules, and it does direct to 100% of the initial procedure and then 50% for secondary and subsequents, with the appropriate modifier. And if you look into the tables on the fee schedule tables that are published for outpatient procedures, they will list, the multiple procedure rule applicability for that service. So based on the 100% and 50% for subsequent and whether the procedures are eligible for NPR, the combination of the rules on the ground rules and the tables. So good question.
So outpatient accounts will need the invoices but not inpatient?
No. There will be no instances where invoices will be required. I think the distinction we're making between inpatient and outpatient is you get paid additionally on the outpatient side for implants above the other services that you get paid for on a bill. You get paid bill charges times, whatever the percentage rate is in the region. On the inpatient side, there is just no additional reimbursement. It's just part of the overall DRG bundle. But in neither case are you required to produce implant invoices for the payer in order to get paid.
Yeah, and that's a great point and a great question. The ground rules specifically say that no documents relating to the cost of a device such as the invoice from the manufacturer shall be required. So we fully expect payers to ask for them, but it is on the hospital to inform the payers that that's not a required document for payment under the fee schedule.
Will the outpatient implant invoices be a mandatory requirement to process the claim for payment?
No, I think we just covered that in the last answer.
Is the lesser of language being applied to each line of the claim versus at the revenue code or total claim level?
Yes, it is a line item application. So when you are taking a look at your analyses, make sure you incorporate that line item level comparison because it'll be very different. The line item difference in lesser of will be very different than the global reimbursable difference. So make sure you understand that. That's a great question to ask, though, and that's a nuance that every hospital should understand as they budget for next year. All right, so we have another question here. Where can I get the fee schedule rates for my team review? I know we talked about this a few times, but all the fee schedule rates are available on the Virginia WorkComp website. And if you go to the Virginia WorkComp Commission website, you'll see a notice under the main page called Fee Schedules Special Notice. If you click on that, it'll take you to a page where you click like an end-user license agreement and take you to the different tables and the ground rules as well. So good question there.
we also see a question here, do the payers have to pay any faster in 2018? And actually, no, the prompt payment provision that went into effect in 2014 still remains the same, 60 days for an undisputed bill and 45 days for notice of denial.
Will the dispute resolution process change?
No, that's a good question, and one that we expected that would have. The dispute process is staying the same. We don't expect any changes there. So what we do anticipate is that the amount of disputes will decrease because of some of the clarity the fee schedule has brought. But the actual mechanism for disputes will remain the same.
Since there are still areas that will be reimbursed based on a percentage of provider charges, what within the rules will provide a means of defining this so payers and providers are not disputing markups and what is U and C?
So that's maybe a question we all have, right? Yes, the fee schedule is codifying what the charge or payment should be, but we are under no illusion that the payers are just going to cut checks based on those numbers. History has told us that they are going to work very hard to identify unrealistic treatment and charges that would be in excess of what they consider to be usual and customary. Like I said earlier, the payer community has spent a lot of money building out a very robust cost containment system, and it's going to be very difficult to just turn that off in January because the fee schedule says 1 + 1 = 2.
Yeah, so there's nothing specifically in the fee schedule that relates bill charges to usual and customary bill charges. Simply says certain items are to be paid at a percentage of billed charges.
Right.
And certainly I think the provider's position should be, hey, here's what I billed, here's what the percentage rate is, and here's what the reimbursement should be. Fairly straightforward calculation.
Yes. I think this will probably take us back to scenarios where maybe you won't have bill charge discrepancies, but you'll have an area where you'll see payers that are applying professional review, nurse review, and other types of reviews that are going to remove charges from bills as opposed to disputing the charges themselves.
Is the June 5th, 2017 ground rules final, or will an edited version be published?
Jay, are the rules that are out there now the last bit?
That is final out there now, unless something should change with this last comment period, which, unless something comes through, I see that this would be final, based on what's listed out there now, because that's what they're asking for, is comments on the final approved rules by the Workers' Comp Commission.
There you go. Thank you for that. It's a good question. Here's another question. How is trauma defined on the bill, because this has been a hurdle in other states? That's a good question. The ground rules do specifically define trauma as admission or transfer to a level 1 or level 2 trauma center, and they give a range of DRGs that are applicable. So it is very specific as to what is trauma, which is good. So there will not be as much ambiguity as to, was the trauma team activated, was it coded properly, specifically for these DRGs into those level 1, level 2 trauma centers would allow the trauma to get paid at that percent of charge rate. Allie, do we have any more questions?
For IP claims, is the DRG system APR, DRG, or MS-DRG?
It's been developed by the state, but it is based upon an MS-DRG system.
Yeah, and specifically, it's going to be MS-DRG version 30, according to the ground rules. Good question. Do we have any other questions? Okay.
So thank you guys all for attending the webinar, and a special thanks to Jay Andrews and the team at the Virginia Hospital Association for allowing us to share some time with you today. As I said, the presentation will be available on our website in the next few days. We hope you enjoyed learning about the upcoming changes in 2018 regarding the new work comp fee schedule. If you'd like more information about something we discussed here today or have additional questions about the fee schedule or would just like to learn more about how you can partner with EnableComp to maximize your work comp reimbursement, you can contact us at marketing@enablecomp.com. Thanks again, and we hope we have a chance to speak with you after the next webinar.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.